10, 15 years ago, when you think about routing, it was file system. You have a URL, and the URL reflects just your file system structure. So you have some static HTML files, and if you want to link to the about page, you write about.html. The browser follows that, the web server delivers that file, and that was routing for you, figuring out what content you want. I was looking for an example and found one. Yeah, I was quite surprised to see that thing is still up. I was even more surprised to see it was downloaded, like it's still downloaded 2 or 3 times every week. And I seriously hope nobody is using that anymore. But the point I want to make is you have these PHP files, and probably some of them include other things. And that's still the routing, the different URLs, the way of telling the application what you want is you call this file or that file, which is very bad for different reasons. Oops, sorry. Well, your application architecture probably shouldn't reflect what pages you have. It's maybe not the main or only thing to organize your application around. What about URL schemas? If you want to have some consistency in the URLs, if you want to be able to change the URLs, then you would, with the thing before, you would have to start changing the file names for that. And if you include other files, maybe you have to change all the application because you have to change that file name so that the URL would look different. And then there is this thing with search engines that I really love to see the relevant words in the URL. So what you start doing is you want to have nice URLs with all the relevant words in it. You would have to put that into the file names, and it doesn't work nice. And if you want to link to something, you will have to write the name of the target file. Doesn't work either. So let's go back to the future. And future is now. I guess if you ever configure the web server for Symfony, you have seen this line. The idea of this, of me showing this here, is instead of having different files and the URL matches to a file on your file system, with Symfony and with other modern applications, what you have is you have one entry point into the whole application, and you make the web server basically redirect everything, rewrite everything onto that file. So Symfony will be called with this app PHP, and then Symfony can take over and figure out what to do. And your web server doesn't need to do that, or rather, you don't need the files for each URL. Now, why do we bother with like a component and reusable routing and whatnot? It can be quite easy. And if this is all you need, then, well, in this case, maybe even a static files would be still okay. But that's the essence of a router. You look at the URL that is requested after this rewriting, and you figure out how to deliver the content that was asked for. Now, well, yeah, we could have some URLs that are not simple. Like here we have just string matching. It must be exactly about. If it was about.html, it would stop working in this example. And if we have something like a product URL where we can display any product and we get that by ID, we want to pass a dynamic ID. We don't want to write that switch case for every single ID, so we start using patterns. Regular expressions, probably. So you could, instead of that switch, you would do if the path matches this expression, then go that way and pass the ID along or something. but that can get quite inflexible. It's actually not very efficient. Regular expressions can be slow, and routing is the first thing that happens in your application. It's the thing that happens always, so performance really matters here. So, and usually these things are not easy to achieve when you want to roll your own. So use a library like Symfony routing component. And at its base, what this component does, it transforms either a path or a request object into an array. And that's about it. And if you have the full stack Symfony framework, the most interesting part that you always have in that array is this underscore controller, which tells Symfony how to continue from that point on. That's the interface, and that's routing in the end. And everything else is all about flexibility, about performance. But in the end, routing is this match request. I have a request. I need to know to what thing this now matches, what I should do next. Now, the Symfony default router is using a bunch of classes and things to make this configurable, flexible, extensible, and everything. You have a route collection, which is just like all the routes that the system should know about. And you can configure that. You can define what's in that collection in different formats, like XML, like YAML, like the annotations, or you can actually write PHP code that does it if you need to be dynamic. And then it has these two pieces, the URL matcher, which is about the thing we've just seen, about telling which route is the right one, and then getting the information from the route, so you have an array with information. And the other one is the URL generator. I don't really talk a lot about that today, but the thing about it is you want to link to your own stuff, usually, in your application, and you don't want to hard-code URLs, so it's very useful when we have this collection of routes anyway, that you can say, I want to have a link to that route. And there is this router object that basically just wraps the matcher and the generator and a thing called loader interface, which is all about building this route collection in the first place. And then it does caching. It goes quite far with caching, actually. So, little quiz, just to see if you're still awake. What would be the fastest way to configure routing? Like, what's the best way to use if you care about performance? Should you do YAML or XML or PHP annotations, maybe? Other opinions? Doesn't matter is the right answer, because, well, it matters a little bit during development, but you don't care about 10 milliseconds, 50 milliseconds in development occasionally, because the whole routing information is read, it's gathered together, and if you have a big application, that can be quite a thing to do, always, even if it was PHP code. And then the information is written into the cache. And actually, well, some of you probably know this, but it's good to be aware of it. When you're in the dev environment, like typically when you do use app_dev, then Symfony is checking each time, did the routing files change? Do I have to rebuild that cache? So that's convenient for developing, but it adds some little overhead because all these files need to, it needs to keep track of all that and figure out, do I need to rebuild the cache? And when you're in production mode, it doesn't happen like if the information was not there, it's cached once and then it's written and Symfony never cares again if the file changed. So you have to explicitly call cache clear to rebuild the information. Now, the whole routes first are built into this collection and merged together, because you can have different loaders. You can have, if you use some bundles that provides routes, you might have noticed they typically use XML. You might use annotations or YAML. You can mix it all together. It doesn't matter. It's all collected into this route collection. And then once that the information is assembled, Symfony goes and dumps a router, actually, like a new class that implements the router interface, which is just one single class with all the information in it. It doesn't depend on any route objects anymore. There is no route object afterwards. And what it does, it analyzes the whole collection and tries to be really, really smart. For example, if it sees, oh, there is a whole group of URLs that look similar, they start with the same prefix. Well, first thing we could check, do they start with this prefix? And then if they do, we further figure out what exactly we have. And if they don't, we go to the next step. No need to check 3 times if a route starts with a specific pattern. And as far as possible, it uses strpos, like the string position thing, over regular expressions, because that's way faster. And when I prepared the talk, I talked with Tobias Schulze about like if he has some more details, and he explained me some stuff he did to really optimize that with the regular expressions, even because even there's like tweaks you can do that usually, like he's checking if it's possible or not with the expression you have, and usually it is possible to do further tweaks to even have faster regular expressions and whatnot. Actually, I then did look at that code. I didn't really understand all the details, and I think the important thing to know is it's like really efficient. You don't need to look at it all the time. It's nice that Symfony is doing that for you. Yeah, that's the illustration for what I just said on this grouping. So it would first check, do I even have something that starts with foo? And if it does, well, is the next thing an X or a Y? And if it's nothing of those two, it would fall out and continue with the next match. And it just goes through that list but like grouping it as much as it can. And with that information, you realize that actually there is something that can matter, or actually 2 things. So one, if you have some URLs that are way more frequent in your application than others, then try to make them come first. So if you know, whatever, I offer some REST API thing, and that has like tons of different routes, and on the same application I have some basic pages, then maybe make the pages come first. Or if you know like this call is the thing that's called all the time and the rest is not important, make it come first. It won't make a big difference, but it does make some difference. What can be a bit more relevant is the order matters. So if you have like similar grouped routes, if they come one after the other and not totally mixed up together, you will be more efficient. Now, one more thing that's mainly about generating routes. When you're in the web context, you had a web request, then Symfony knows the domain name. It knows whether you want HTTP or HTTPS because it can look at the request, and the request has that information. However, when you're, for example, on the command line, because you have a Symfony command that wants to generate URLs, you will need to tell Symfony about this. So one way to do it is setting the information on the context. There is another way to configure it in Symfony globally, but I guess often like that would only work if there is only one domain and one thing that your application does. If it has multiple domain names, it wouldn't work anymore. And well, the routing can do a lot. There could be cases where you want to build your own router. Just some words of caution for that. The router is the thing that is used on every single request. So if you make it slow, then you really take a hard penalty on your application. And also, if you try to do that in a reusable bundle, ever be aware that there will be side effects all over the place, always, as soon as you change things. Like by now, I guess it got better, but in the beginning, a lot of people were using, like type hinting the Symfony core router instead of the router interface. So as soon as you replace that, things stopped working. But there is more subtle effects with these services if you start renaming route names under the hood. A lot of things can get tricky. And actually, most of the time, what you want to look at, and I will come back to that later, is the route loaders, because usually you just need more ways to provide routes. You don't need a new way of doing the routing. If you actually do need it, then look at the chain router, which is a thing to use several routers inside one application. So now let's look a bit at the Symfony full stack framework. So far I was mainly talking about just the routing component. Well, this one I just stole from the Symfony documentation, so you might have seen it before. What we see is, again, this process. We have the request coming in, and all goes to the front controller, the app PHP. And app PHP instantiates the kernel and tells the kernel, figure out, do something with this. And the kernel, like among other things, is doing this routing thing to figure out what controller it needs to call. And once it has that, it can go to the controller, and the controller will provide a response. Now, routes can come out of different things. You're probably all familiar with the YML, the XML, the PHP, the annotations. PHP files, for like PHP routing files, to me, like most of the time, you don't want to write that. It's just more verbose and not in any way better. It comes in handy if you need some kind of flexibility, if you, for example, build something that should run on different systems, and for some reason you have to read some information to decide if a route should exist or what it should do. And then you can do your own route loaders that build routes based on something else, like typically not configuration files, but some information. Since Symfony 2.8, there is also the possibility, this is kind of just a shortcut to not need to write the whole route loader and register that, you can just have a service with a method, and then you define in your routing file that there is a service providing routes, and the syntax is basically like the controller syntax. So you tell a service name and the method to call on it, and this thing should return a route collection. So a first example of a custom route loader is in the FOSS REST bundle. So FOSS REST bundle, it's a bit like what Kevin just talked about in his API platform. It's about providing you an easy automatic routing based on you have a controller with actions. You use some kind of naming pattern on like what the method name translates to part of the URL, and if it's post, it's a post action. If it's a get action. These kind of things. And if you do a REST API, you really don't want to write out all the routing information because it's just redundant. And well, FOSS REST bundle does also other stuff, but in routing it does this. So you can say, have this new type of routing called REST, and that's FOSS REST bundle that defined this name. And as a resource, you specify the controller that should be automatically routed. And then FOSS REST bundle, like during this cache warm-up thing, when the Symfony routing is gathering all the routes, you will it will trigger FOSS REST bundle. FOSS REST bundle will load the controller class, do reflection to see what methods do we have, what arguments do the methods have, and you can do some annotations to further tweak information, to further tweak naming or add prefixes and whatnot. And one nice thing about this is if you refactor, you don't need to, it's like everything is in one place. You change the method name, the URL changes, and not like you have the routing file somewhere, you have your application, and when you change, you have to manually keep them in sync. Then one example of real custom routers is for multi-language. So when you have a translated website and you want to translate your URLs, so typically what you want is you want to be able to define a language-specific URL for each route for SEO reasons, for the users to be more localized. And there are several bundles that do this. They want to detect the locale so that you know what language the request is in. And the thing that can also be tricky is they need to generate the URL in the right language. You typically also want to be able, if you're in one language, to generate a link to the other language. And you don't want to, I mean, you could just like configure routes, like one route per language, but that doesn't scale very well. So especially if your route is a bit more than just controller and locale, you would just copy-paste a lot of configuration, which is a bad idea. So one of them is the JMS I18N routing bundle, which basically takes the pattern, the path of the route, and runs that through Symfony translation. So the route looks like it normally does. You don't even need to touch it or change it. But you define translations in this route namespace, and the translation key is the name of the route. And then when Symfony is building the route cache, the JMS I18N routing bundle injects its own loader. It overrides the default Symfony route loading and goes and duplicates every route into every language. So at that point you will get duplication, but that's fine because it's just it's generated, so you don't mind. The other one I'm aware of is the bsimple I18N. They use something a bit different. They have this, the route type, so you need to specify this is a route not of the default type, but of this bsimple type. And instead of path, they have these locales, which, yeah, it's just a matter of taste. In one, you have the translation files, it's all separate. Here, you have it like all together in one place. which usually is okay because anyway you don't want your translators, probably you don't want to have them change URL names directly. Could be a bit risky if they put in white space and whatnot. Well, both of these have like this tricky problem that the route that we define here, it's called homepage. So normally, if I say generate me the homepage route, Symfony would know what to do. But when you duplicate routes, each route needs to have its own name that is unique. And so they duplicate routes in the collection. So they have to do some naming scheme to keep them separate, which if you have something else that looks at the route collection, it will get confusing because all the routes are actually called different. And the generator part is overwritten by these bundles so that they take the name you give it and figure out which language you wanted. They generate this special name, and then they generate actually that other route. Then, to take things one step further, with the content management framework, we built a thing we call dynamic router. And the idea there is if you have really like lots and lots of URLs that are typically about some content, so you want your editors to be able to define the URLs, and they need to change frequently, then the routing, like the standard Symfony routing has one like limitation, which is it has to write this route cache. So whenever you would change a URL name or the URL path, you would have to rewrite the whole caching file. And if you have a CMS type of page with thousands of products, thousands of whatever entries, you would have to rewrite that cache with thousands of entries, which gives you a problem. On the other hand, this router is meant to look at the request and then go do a database lookup or API lookup or something to figure out what is the route that matches this or that could match this request, and then the Symfony routing can try to match that. And if you have an index on the database table, this is basically, it will scale without problems to tens of thousands or whatever number of different URLs for content. And the nice thing is you're still using the full-fledged like Symfony routing concept, because I showed this example earlier with product and then the ID pattern. Of course, you could do product and then Slack, so you could have some SEO-friendly name. But if you have different type of entities in your system, you would end up having like product slash and user slash and whatever, and that in itself is not very elegant to the end users. And if the SEO people want to like build the URL tree the way they like it, you will have a problem because you have this one kind of pattern leads to one controller. And if you do it this way, like whatever is looked up from the database is a route, so it can go to different controllers. You could just replace one route with a redirect route, which with the product you can't really, or all your controllers would need to be able to handle redirects, and it would get messy. And then this chain router thing, which comes whenever you want to use different routers in combination. So it just takes a bunch of routers with priorities, so that and then it just tries one after the other, and the first one that matches wins. Now let's look a bit further beyond like strictly routing. So in Symfony, you have the kernel, and routing just is like plugged into Symfony kernel at this kernel.request event with priority 32, whatever. But it means if you want to do something before the routing even triggers, you could have an event listener that has a higher priority. And if you want to do more stuff after this matching happened, when there is just the parameters array from the routing, you could add more event listeners. And one neat thing that comes from I think it's in the Sensio framework extra bundle or Sensio extra bundle or whatever it's called, the param converter. Yeah, I'm gonna show that in a bit more, but it's about transforming just IDs or something to real objects so that your controller can be more simple. Another diagram from the Symfony documentation. So the blue squares, this is the events. You have this kernel request, and then after that event happened, the kernel will try to resolve the controller class, and once it found the controller, it will have this kernel controller event, which is like your yet another chance to change things before the controller is actually called. And that's where the param converters happen, because they care about what controller class is actually found. So param converter is supposed to translate some ID or slug or something, or like a datetime string, into an object. It looks at the method signature of the controller, and you have an annotation that says like, yeah, this argument should be converted, and the type in says, oh, this is my model user. So you could have a param converter that says, if we need a user and we have some ID parameter in the request, we do a database lookup with Doctrine ORM and load that user and put that in the request object. So your controller can say, I want a user object. I don't want, I don't know, be initialized with the Doctrine entity manager. I get an ID, I do a lookup. If I find a user, I'm happy. If I don't, I do some error and whatever. That's the param converter. It moves that out of the controller. And for Doctrine ORM, there is a default one that already exists, which can act like if the naming all matches, it works pretty much magically out of the box. And if the naming of the parameter name and the entity field don't match, then you would have to use some annotations to help it figure out what to actually do. Or if you need to tweak the query it has to do, you can do that. And then you can also do your own converters. I recently did that in a project where we have no local database, but we have an API, and we just do a call to the API to fetch the object before we even go to the controller. And it made the controller a lot simpler because it doesn't need to care about the repository anymore. It doesn't need to do any error handling anymore. And we have like different controllers that expect the same type of object. So you have just one converter that converts for all these controllers. So actually it was removing duplication. And it's not very hard to write your own converters. Another example of, well, this one is actually bypassing the whole routing thing, because we just, in this bundle, there is a case where the proxy, caching proxy is doing a special request saying, actually, I just need the hash for this URL. I don't need to get the content. So what we did is we listened on the request, and in this listener, well, we check what is the accept header, and if it's our magic header, we do our thing. We create a response object and set that on the event. And as soon as you set a response on this event, on a kernel request event listener, the kernel will stop processing further. It will stop triggering events and just return that response, which can be a way, if you have like this special case like here, to abort before it even hits a controller. Another thing to just add on top of routing in the Leap theme bundle, where you can set, usually by cookie, but also by other means, you can define what theme you're in. And for A/B testing, we had a case where we said, oh, but we just should have different controllers depending on whether we are A or B, because it's like so different what we do. We don't want to handle that all in the same controller. It doesn't make sense. So we left the controller in, but we added this new default, which says, well, there is theme specific controllers, and if theme is called A, use that. If it's B, use the other. And then we have a listener, which happens after the routing, when we have the routing information. And the listener looks at the current theme. And if the request, because if we put like anything in these defaults, they go into the attributes of the request. And you cannot only use that in the controller arguments, you can also use that here in the listener. And we say, oh, is there special controllers configured? And then we can just change the controller attribute to something else, and the request will go to a different controller. Now, you have to be careful with these things, because it's an easy way to totally confuse yourself, because you have no clue anymore what's happening. But in special cases, I think it makes sense, and I think this configuration, it's still, when you look at it, you still figure out, oh, actually there is something more than just controller. If there was just the listener and the configuration would live somewhere completely different, it could get quite tricky to figure out what's going on in your application. Another one, that's a breadcrumb bundle a colleague of mine did, where he's using the routing configuration to like control a breadcrumb, to build a breadcrumb. And basically he puts these options in the route and says, well, one thing is if you specify a label, then it will be shown as a breadcrumb, and you can specify a parent route, so it goes to find a route with that name and build a breadcrumb out of these routes, which can be neat to build breadcrumbs. And the example is just, again, you can add stuff on top of the routing to make your applications more easy. And that was about it. Now, I hope we have time for some questions. So. Do we have microphones for the questions? Ah, okay. So 1 second.
Hello. Once upon a time, I had a controller with root annotations, and I tried to inherit from this controller, and I couldn't, because there was a circular dependency between controller, routing, controller service, routing service, and so on. So I wonder, why is that? Because you told that you have a common type, common way of generating routing cache. So why do I have this circular dependency. So when I moved my root definitions to YAML, everything worked fine. But with annotations, I got a problem with circular dependency.
I can't tell you exactly why you got this problem, but I would expect problems. The thing is that like with inheritation,
yes,
if you have two controllers,
I had a bundle with controllers where routing was defined by annotations.
Yeah.
I created another bundle and I inherited from controller.
Yeah, the problem is if you have the controller as a routing thing, like a register that has public methods that have routing,
Yes.
and you inherit, you will have the method is visible in the inherited class, in the inheriting class as well. So suddenly we will have 2 times the same method with the same annotations in 2 places. And I can imagine that something gets confused by that. Because you would have the same method in the base class, in the child class, with the same action, with the same route name. So
no,
that
the route names and
confuse
routes
things.
were different, but actually method was the same. Method name and signature was the same. So that's a problem, I imagine.
But you overrode the method.
Yes, I overrode the method and changed the root names, root definitions, and I still got this circular dependency.
All right. Well, then I would expect it to work. I don't know.
Thank you.
Hi. So
Hey?
imagine that you have a root that you have to change for SEO reasons, but you already have in Google on search engines a lot of already indexed URLs. Is there any way, a quick way to face this problem doing then the 301 redirect? I know you can maybe keep both in controller and do the redirect, but if there any easy way to just like keep the old one and configure that you want to do 300 redirect because you want to fix all the indexed URLs?
I wouldn't know of an automated way. You can have you can configure redirect routes in the YAML or XML configuration. With there is a cookbook entry about that, how you define that this pattern should redirect to this other thing. Using in the framework bundle, there is a redirect controller that does that. And you can redirect to URLs or redirect to a route name. So you do have that, but you would have to do it manually, and I wouldn't really see how you could automate that. Okay, so we're out of time. Thanks a lot, and see you around.